everybody out first, don't I?
One, two, three, four.
Good evening, ladies and gents. Dan just had a little slurp of his beer then, I think, just as we started. Welcome back to another episode of the Edufuturists podcast. It is bright blue skies outside in the evening in the northwest of England, where I am. So it's all smiles. Some scaffolding outside my door. We're having some building work done, but what about you two, Jen? Oh, look at Steve. Steve, a bit of product placement there. Gents, how's your week been? What have you been up to? Steve, you've obviously had a delivery, so let us know what's happening.
Yeah, look at this bad boy. What a lovely cup.
For those people that are
this is making for great podcast material.
It does, because people can watch it in Spotify. I don't know if you know that, Dan, but it's not bad. I am drinking out of, we decided it's metal. The Edufuturists Uprising, the event that's taking place 2 weeks today. The merch arrived for everybody that's ordered merch. Ours has arrived. I was going to wear it and I was like, nah, keep it under wraps. It's exciting times. So yeah, it's all come through. The office is and the room is filling up. And we've still got the awards to arrive yet.
Just wait till Dan's form letters arrive. He hasn't told you about that.
Yeah. There'll be styrofoam, little things broken off it like last time that we'll have to colour in. So yeah, everything's good. It's been a nice week to be at home, working from home this week, which is always it's a positive. Sun's shining, legs feel a little bit better after a long run at the weekend, and 3.5 weeks out from marathon now, so getting serious. Got 22 miles this weekend, and then
I remember that training run. That's an horrible one. That the last long run before the big one.
Yeah, a couple of week build and then 2 week taper down. So just trying to keep injury free or as injury free as possible and keep the legs moving. I think that's the intention.
Especially at your age, yeah.
Exactly. So I ran with a group of much younger guys, and their pace was too much. We went out and did 17 miles on Sunday, and I kept pace with them for 10 miles and then dropped back to my usual pace. But it had killed the legs by that point. My own fault for trying to keep up with the young ones. It's my own fault.
How are you, Dan? Well?
Very well, yeah. All going well. Just cracking on. Got promo in the new book and working in. I spent all day doing some prompt craft today. Working on some prompt for a ed tech company, some AI work. So yeah, all good. But I don't know about what you feel, but especially on a Thursday when we do this on an evening and you've been at your computer all day, sat in the same room, I'm looking forward to getting some fresh air. Hopefully it'll still be light when we finish.
But also, we're going to get some fresh air from our wonderful guest today, who's going to give us lots and lots of wonderful ideas.
Glad you said fresh air there, not hot air. That would have been...
Wow.
Cameron, the hot air will come from us, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say that was free.
It's very much so. So I think without further ado, it'd be good to bring in our guest. We'll let him introduce himself, let him tell us all about the work that he does. But we are very, very pleased to welcome our guest for Edufuturists podcast this evening. Hello,
happy to be here. Sunny in Sheffield too.
Is it?
So yeah, it's good. It's the one day.
Well, I'm not too far from you. It's been sunny all week for me in Leeds. A little bit up the M1, but it's been it's definitely t-shirt and short weather in Yorkshire, isn't it?
Yeah, it's unusual. Global warming, I think.
So, Ger, tell us a little bit about you. Introduce yourself, and let our listeners find out a little bit about what you do.
Oh, blimey! So I'm Ger Graus. I'm now a global education advisor. Work with companies and governments and other organisations, NGOs, advising them on, in the case of startups, on where to go with the business, and in terms of governments, where to not go quite often, I think. It's fair to say. Before that, I was the first global education director for KidZania, which are cities built for children aged 4 to 14, where they can experience the world of work without being harassed or helicoptered by adults or parents. And before that, I was the founding chief executive of the Children's University, which was a charity that was started to have young people 5 to 14 experience learning outside the classroom, outside the school, in places that they might otherwise not go to. The youngsters were particularly from the disadvantaged areas. Head of that, I was the education director for 2 education action zones in a part of Manchester called Wythenshawe, next to Manchester Airport. So I actually had an office in Terminal 1. I was there at the time when Marcus Rashford was at Button Lane Primary School, so I happily take all the credit for what he and how brilliant he is. And before that, I moved to this country nearly 40 years ago now. I came. The intention was to come for 1 year and teach German. That 1 year is now officially the longest year in Christendom, I think. And moved to Norwich, small school, starting with 69 children. Secondary school was literally opened, and then it grew. And after about 5 years, I moved to Kingston upon Hull, and I moved from a school. You get these experiences, don't you? So I moved from a school with 500 children in Norwich, in a reasonably affluent part of Norwich, to a school with 2,250 children on a deprived council estate in Hull. And whilst in Norwich I knew all the names of all the children in the school, I knew good things about them. In Hull, it took quite a while to get to know all the staff. I did that for 3 years. I was invited onto the National Curriculum Working Group for Modern Languages, then became Languages Advisor in Manchester. Then for a little while joined the dark side and became an inspector. But moved back from Darth Vader to Anakin Skywalker again quite soon. I moved to Salford and then started that thing because by that time we'd had the national curriculum, we'd had Ofsted put in place, and we had started that drive towards that kind of teach and test culture. And when you work with young people in general, but particularly with young people from more disadvantaged backgrounds and contexts, then you see that test and teach and test culture is really not that good. And actually the disadvantage grows because it isn't about learning anymore. It is about what you're being taught. So that's why I then made that move into Wythenshawe initially, and then to the Children's University to kind of look at what can we do outside of school that enhances life opportunities for children and links with a bit in school. And at the same time started doing research with Cambridge University initially, and then got a professorship at the National Research University in Moscow. And we do a lot of research around that contribution that out of school experiences make experience-based learning, I suppose. Not in the traditional, is your maths getting better sense, but in the traditional, or maybe the less traditional, I am becoming a more confident learner. And by becoming a more confident learner, you know that, don't you? Give me a confident learner and I'll bring you the grades. So that's the story, really. And at the moment, as I say, I'm advising kind of left, right, and centre, and have just been invited by a publisher to start writing a book, which will probably be published, I don't know, certainly within the next 100 years, because I'm quite slow at writing, I have to say. So that's it in a big nutshell, I suppose.
That sounds it's fascinating. It's always good when you get to hear the potted history of somebody who comes on as a guest, and you think you know bits of them. You've done some research. You feel like you know something about them, and then you talk about the professorship and you do the work in Wythenshawe and all that. So we're really grateful for you to join us, and we know that your range of experiences has kind of you've seen some real challenge, even that element of big schools and deprivation. So I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of an insight into what you feel you've seen that kind of the state of education.
Well, I think it's you learn from experience. I mean, I think that's what experience-based learning is about for young people, and it should be for us. So I think all those things you need to stick a little bit into your back pocket, so that at some point later in life you can refer to it and you can use it. And I think the other thing we do, we overcomplicate things. We keep it simple, because then everybody understands it, and when everybody understands it, everybody can own it when we try to do something about it. So the first step really was that school in Norwich that was small, that had brilliant leadership. A teacher who looked after newly appointed staff, but the strength of the school was that we knew every child in the school, and in many ways that allowed you to plan better, that allowed you to build scaffolding around every child so that they could each climb as high as they could possibly go, right? And that's incredibly important. And of course we had a brilliant head teacher who on my Mrs. Daines, Jean Daines, who called me on my very first day into her office, and in the morning at 8:25, and said, just before you go, make sure you enjoy yourself, and make sure you make mistakes, and make sure you learn from them. Off you go. And sometimes when I look now, I wonder whether that conversation still takes place. I hope it does. And she gave us a license to work with the youngsters that we knew, and the size of the school played a very significant part in that. And then she also asked to see me 5 years later and said, it's time you left. And the human reaction to that, of course, is, oh my God, what have I done wrong, right? And she said, nothing, but you'd go stale if you stay. So here's the job I think you should apply for. I've spoken to the head teacher of the school. I've given a reference, and I'm sure you'll get an interview. And I moved from this very secure environment that was also reasonably affluent to this huge school as part of Hull School's reorganization in 1988, where middle school teachers became secondary school teachers, and middle school teachers also became primary school teachers, where special schools were closed and special school children were moved into mainstream. And I realized very quickly, I learned a great deal, but I realized very quickly that we actually in this country don't make, when it comes to reorganizations and restructures, we don't make education decisions. We make economic decisions. And we don't talk about the children, and we don't talk about the families, and we don't talk about their contexts and their communities, but actually they are economic decisions. Because I can't think for a single reason why you would have, especially in disadvantaged contexts, why you would have schools of that size. Because the more the youngsters are up against it, the more we need to know them, so that we can build better scaffolding, so that they too can climb as high as they might want to go. And that was a big lesson. And the school was a success, the big school. It was a success not because of the policies, and not even because of the money that went into it, but it was a success because of the hard work of the teachers, and because the teachers liked the kids. Right? But in a sense, we disadvantaged educationally. We disadvantaged those youngsters further by putting them into that environment. So the lesson from Norwich was about small schools and head teachers who are brilliant and have a vision and who back you and the large school was about, this is not right for so many children. And I remember on one day, one of the youngsters coming late into my registration, and I just turned around and said, why are you late? And the answer was, because Mr. Jones kept me behind. And I had no idea who Mr. Jones was. I had to look, and we had three. So I was too embarrassed to ask which one it was, really. I let it go. So those things, I think, don't help those children and don't help those families. Because also, if you think that in those circumstances, quite often the families and the communities perhaps are not as engaged and convinced by schools and education as they might be. So what you then do is you build very big fences and you make it really difficult for people to actually get into the place and talk to somebody. And everything gets made more difficult, and the bigger the school, I think. So that was a big lesson. And then my national curriculum, my national curriculum involvement was a fluke, basically. It was a total fluke, because there was 1988, 1989, and there were 19 languages on the statutory orders, all the languages of the EU and a good number of others. And I was at the time chief examiner for Dutch GCSE, having been born in Holland and whatever. And I'm sure that the National Curriculum Council couldn't find anybody who could speak Dutch, basically. So I got this grand title of a member of the National Working Group, but I stumbled into it rather than was chosen for brilliance or anything else. But it was cool. It was good to be part of it. It was my first glimpse of how in Westminster policy is made. It was the first time also, he says tongue-in-cheek, that I met lots of people who make policies about people in areas they've never visited. And we'll probably come back to that later at some point. And it was also interesting to observe that there were some really good people. It was chaired by Sir Martin Harris, that group, who was at the time the Vice Chancellor of Manchester University. And some really good people with some really good ideas, and most of that was ignored. Like, one of the ideas was, can we please have languages into primary schools, which seems to make complete sense, but all of that was kind of put to one side. But it did lead to me then going to Manchester, becoming languages advisor, blown away by Manchester as a city that is so diverse and at the same time was in part so deprived. It was such a mix that it was a very interesting place to work with amazing people, in amazing head teachers in schools. And then we did introduce languages into primary schools, and we got European money to do it. And I set up links with Bologna in Italy and Clermont-Ferrand and Madrid, Alcalá, and Chemnitz in the former East Germany. And we sent lots of teachers to be trained, and there was a real buzz about the place that we were doing this. And we linked all these schools, primary schools and secondary schools, with schools in other cities, and children started taking part in exchanges, and there were cultural projects, and there was a buzz. And I thoroughly enjoyed that, and the schools bought into this. And I suppose many years later, when I was in Wythenshawe, the highlight of that was there were a number of primary schools in Wythenshawe who offered Italian to their children. And that was supported by the Italian consulate, and they provided free teachers, and we had language assistants and all sorts. And we did, with Neil Morrissey and a few others, we ran a project whereby we took Shakespeare to Italy. And it was a year-long project. And there are 14 Shakespeare plays set in Italy. And we had, with Shakespeare for Kids, we reduced each play to 10 minutes, 5 minutes in Italian and 5 minutes in English. And then had a year's rehearsals and auditioning, and Neil Morrissey and others helped us with that. And then, courtesy of sponsorship by British Airways and Manchester Airport, we actually flew 50 kids to perform live in the Piazza Santo Stefano in Bologna on Italian television. And parents traveled by bus and by car and whatever else. And the point was actually born out of anger. The project was born out of anger because when we said that we were going to do Italian in Wythenshawe schools, there was a response more than once. The response was, you can't do that with those kids. And I remember walking onto the stage in Bologna, and actually I think the opening words were, you were wrong. We can do anything we want with these kids, as long as the community is behind us. So they were good times. I look back on those very fondly. And then you kind of, I don't know, it happens, doesn't it? You follow a certain path, because then you go from advisor to being an inspector, and then you become a senior inspector. And at the same time, Ofsted came along, and local authorities got involved in Ofsted inspections because they needed to earn money rather than having to sack staff. So this was misinterpreted, right? Ofsted saying the local authorities are behind us. No, that just wasn't true, right? The local authorities had Ofsted teams because in those days it was a very lucrative thing to do. So I became for a little while part of those teams, and some of that in the early days was kind of quite cool, because when you judged in the first framework, 1992, when you judged teaching and learning in terms of the children, you had to judge whether there was awe and wonder in the lesson, which is brilliant, right? It's just brilliant. And particularly if you inspect a primary school, all you got to do is look at their eyes and you know that the awe and wonder is there. But I'm assuming that for the apparatchiks, that really wasn't the measure they were looking for. So all of those nice things were sidelined quite quickly. And then we had, of course, I suppose the best years of my working life in many ways were when we got the Labour government in 1997. And we had that education mantra. And actually, you know, for whatever people say, I think too many people have forgotten that they put their money where their mouth was. There was money in the system. And those communities that I'd been working in, they were being supported. And all of a sudden, there was Sure Start, and there were education action zones, and there was excellence in cities. And there were academies, not like we know them now as political tools, but actually as schools that were identified needing more help than others. And they were very exciting times. And businesses like Manchester Airport got involved in making communities better. And it was a shame that came to an end. And I think the only real criticism I would have of that government, of that Labour government, was that they knew in 1997 that they were going to be in power for 10 to 15 years. There was no way that they were not going to be in power for 10 to 15 years. Yet they still only made 5-year plans. And one plan for 15 years, I think, is better than 3 plans for 5. So I think they could have done more. They should have been braver. They should have been more courageous. They should not have been afraid to make mistakes. And I think we would have been in a better place in 2010. And since 2010, the whole thing has just got politicized.
So
I was glad to move into that out of school experience bit rather than be part of what came after 2010, really.
Because just as obviously you've been going through it, I think I've heard a couple of times in regards to this risk-taking, creating a kind of an environment for psychological safety, the speech by the head teacher of take risks, enjoy it, how the impact of that if students are just been told they're a failure, working towards a test and only judged in that way, that the impact that has, it's not really creating an opportunity for risk and taking chances. And then obviously what the Labour government and the government did, and also all governments should take a better chance and take risks. And I think there's because they're coming for such a short period of time. You know, we had some guests on previously that talked about the life of a minister, an education minister, and often come in and they can't take risks because they don't often know what they're doing to begin with. They're not specialists, and then they're working with people that they've never met, and so on, and different teams. And I think that's a really relevant point, that there isn't that element of psychological safety, of the element of take a risk and try, and failure is seen as this really nasty, negative term, I think, in education and many different things. So in terms of your learning, how do you think that we go back to creating some psychological safety in our education sector? How do we do that? Is that from the structures within it, outside of the teachers and the shackles that they've got, or what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's there isn't one solution, right? And that, firstly, and I think the second thing is it's complex, and we forget that it's complex, because for all that we and I certainly do, for all that we moan and complain and this, that, and the other, if you are the head teacher of a school, when Ofsted walks through the door, or every year when your results are published, to a greater or lesser degree, your neck's on the line, right? So, because it's so serious, that impacts on the kind of way that you might take risks. Your neck's, and then the irony is, I think, that your neck's more on the line, the more difficult an area your school is in, where the children are who need that kind of learning most. So everything's kind of stacked the wrong way, and I think we need to look at these things perhaps a little bit in a simple way. I travel globally. I talk to children wherever I go, really, and the one question I always ask is, "Tell me why you go to school," and the answer far too often is, "Because I have to." And I think the experiences out of school can provide the purpose to the teaching in school, so that the motivation to go to school and the reason to go to school becomes clearer and better to the child, to the parent, to the community, and perhaps to the school itself. I had this very interesting conversation with a group of 9-year-olds in KidZania, London, 3 girls. And KidZania London has a newspaper activity. At the time it was, don't know whether it is now, at the time it was sponsored by the Metro newspaper. And the activity is you produce your own front page. And it looks like the front page of a newspaper, right? So it's quite a cool thing to do. And they loved it. They were going around, they were taking photographs, they were setting, they were correcting each other's spelling. And in the end, they were really proud. And of course, the other thing you've done is you've made learning visible. Yeah. Whereas a grade, I don't know when you go home and you tell your granddad that you've got an A, I don't know that granddad knows what that means, or a 9 or whatever, because these things also change continuously. So I think there is something and when I got talking to those girls and said, "Tell me about English at school," the answer was, "We don't like it very much." And when I asked, "Why don't you like it very much?" the answer becomes, "Well, because we're just being taught and we're being told what we do wrong all the time." And they give pretty good reasons why you might not like something. Yet the activity they're just undertaken, they completely loved. So I think we also need to think as teachers that we can connect with purpose better than we're doing at the moment. If I've got to teach Shakespeare at the end of or during key stage 4, then why don't or A levels, and I have a choice, why don't I first go on the internet and see what plays are on over the next 2 years at the RSC or wherever, and choose my text accordingly, so that actually Shakespeare doesn't have to turn in his grave either and think that 30 youngsters are sitting there reading a play whilst they should be experiencing. So we can do those things. And I often say to teachers, every time you introduce an abstract concept in a lesson, use the words "for example." Because for example is a story, it's a reality, it's a connect to a purpose. So I think there are small steps there. But we also need to take bigger steps, and the bigger steps are about risk taking, and they are about calculated risk. Before people start ringing in, I used the phrase "learning in the wild" in the past, and people used to complain about it as if I was going to send children into the jungle or whatever, right? So people also kind of overreact to this. Learning in the wild. Where we're at now is, I believe that we're at a point in schooling where we need to seriously consider that we need to wild the tame. Because for all sorts of reasons, we are protecting children. And I think we are overprotecting children. And if we don't take risks, every person is an entrepreneur. We are personal entrepreneurs. We are social entrepreneurs. Some of us are business entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship and innovation is about calculated risk. If we don't build that into our provision, into our lessons, into our narrative, we're going to become a really boring country where the only entrepreneurs that exist, quite frankly, are going to be those that go to independent schools, because independent schools still provide that kind of thing because it's within their remit. So we need to think about different partnerships. There are organizations, I come across them all the time, that are beginning to look like this. One is, I think, just about to start to operate in Leeds. It's a small startup yet, but I think they will grow, called Startup Sherpas. And it's about entrepreneurship. And there's a challenge. Can we get a 16-year-old to earn £16,000? And it's cool, right? And schools need to embrace that. And they need to see that there's maths in there and that there is all sorts in there. We just need to be brave enough to do this, and we need to not worry so much about Ofsted, because how would Ofsted not like that? And I do think, incidentally, that after the next election, we will see changes in Ofsted. I think the time has come whereby that's just going to have to be addressed, not least because of recent events, but regardless, should have happened. So Steve, it's a tricky question because we have all these pressures, and we've also got a system whereby we've increasingly disengaged with parents as educators. We'd rather they didn't come into school, and the parents sometimes rather wouldn't come into school anyway, but it's their child we're talking about, and we need to reinvent that dialogue as well. And I think it needs to start in primary schools. The obvious place to start is primary schools, because they are in the community. They have better, more open relationships often with the community. Their fences are lower, I often think, and they're easier in communicating with parents. And we need to come to the point where I'm a bit of a football fan, and I support, as a boy, I supported Ajax Amsterdam, and then naturally started supporting Barcelona because Cruyff and all those guys went there. And Barcelona Football Club has that motto, Més que un club, more than a club. And the motto refers to the fact that it's owned by its members. I think we need to get more than a school. I think we need schools to be owned by their communities. And that doesn't just mean opening them nearly 24/7, right? But it does mean that too. Multiple use and places where you can go. And I know schools where I live now, where caretakers' houses have been converted, where quite frankly, where parents during this winter have been able to come in and sit in the warm so that because they couldn't afford to turn the heating on at home. More than a school, when it's owned by the community, it serves a better purpose, it has better values, and the interactions about the child's education become more meaningful, because my wife's head teacher in Sheffield, and her mantra is every child is everyone's responsibility. It isn't just the teacher, it isn't just the classroom assistant, it is the parent, the community. And if businesses want to inherit children and young people who are ready for the world of work, they need to come off the fence and help make that happen. It's really easy to sit on the fence and complain every year that they haven't got the skills they need to have. Well, come on then, give us a hand properly. So we need time to grow that. And dare I say that, Steve, from your comment earlier as well, it'll take more than 5 years. So perhaps we need to sit all the politicians in one room and reach some form of consensus that whatever government we have, there are certain things that are untouchable, like the accountability is to the child and not to the system. That would be a good start, I think.
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about kind of opening the school up to the community, it's also kind of opening the community up to the students as well, isn't it? That, and then we had Yaakov Hecht from Israel on the podcast a couple of months ago, and He's well known for starting democratic schools, and I think his current project, he calls it a city school, where he essentially says, well, why are we making a school? And I'm paraphrasing him quite a bit here, but why are we making a school a microcosm, or we're trying to make it a microcosm? So we teach our own dance classes, we teach our own this, that. We have subjects, when actually we're part of a city that has this and so much more. So in his school, if you want to take dance and do a dance class, it doesn't make sense to put on a dance class in the school. You go into the city and you do a dance class that's already happening. You go and join some dancers who are dancing already. If you want to learn about a certain profession or a certain subject, then why do it within the school building when there's actually people who are probably a hell of a lot more qualified than the teacher in the school out there doing it, and not just theorizing about it, actually applying it and getting results from it. So how can we learn? How can we send students into the city to learn, or the environment to learn? And I think, yeah,
and give, Dan, and give, right? So I think we underestimate what our children are capable of. So if you take a simple example, one of the things I think that the pandemic taught us, certainly in the cities and probably beyond, is that there were a lot of lonely older people, right, who all of a sudden weren't being visited by relatives, because this was not on the agenda, but it was an area where the pandemic shone a light. It wouldn't take a great deal to work out with a company like, I don't know, Apple or Google or whoever they are, get some of those tablets and get the youngsters to go and teach the older people how to use the tablets, how to FaceTime, and how to do those things. They're infinitely more capable and responsible than we give them credit for. And I think it's a big issue. I do quite a bit of work with the people at Reggio Emilia in northern Italy, the experts in early years learning, where they have that mantra that the environment is the third teacher. And they talk a lot about trust. And we need to trust our children more. The narrative in this country, in England in particular, around children and young people is far too often far too negative. We are very happily standing there on street corners pointing out what goes wrong, but we will very rarely turn around and say that was amazing. And actually, most of what our young people do is at least amazing, but we just need to give them the trust and the responsibility. That there is that wonderful phrase from my favorite book, The Little Prince. The phrase is that all grown-ups were once children, but only few of them remember it. And I think there is ample evidence, and we just need to have different approaches and different views on our young people and what they're capable of, and see them as contributors to the community rather than citizens to be. They already are citizens. They already are perfectly capable of giving and being a part of things. So we need to rethink that as well, I think.
Interestingly there as well, I think that risk element that we've talked about there, you've talked about this need for innovation, the trusting of students that they're capable of more than we think of, the connection to the community, both it's a two-way connection, isn't it, as we were talking about there. You talked about it being underpinned by almost an apolitical movement that says it needs to be almost like education needs to be not connected to the political party that's in power, and it's very interesting that mantra, that's certainly something that we've advocated for, and as we listen to multiple people on this podcast who have said something very similar, which is that we've got to have a longer term vision for education than the term of office for a Secretary of State. And I think even though we have a undersecretaries and we have Department for Education, it's very interesting that any person that ever speaks to anybody from the Department for Education, they talk about the minister and how the civil servants don't always agree with that particular minister, and they have to try and it's a challenge. So how do we come to that point? How do we get to that point of this this longer term view for education?
We need to grow up. Is I think is the short answer. If I could compare it to, say, the Netherlands, where I grew up, or even Germany, in many other countries, you have one after the other coalition governments. Now, they may be good, they may be bad. They're good for some things, they're bad for other things. But I think what they are reasonably good for, particularly in terms of the public sector, health and education, I would say in particular, is over time you reach a consensus. Yeah? So what gets changed in the Netherlands from one government to another is never the core. It might be that there's all of a sudden a bit more money going into early years and a bit less money going into HE or FE, but the core of it is never messed around. Apprenticeships have never disappeared. Right? They've changed, they've modernized, but they've always been there because all parties had reached that consensus. And of course, interesting that after the last general election in the Netherlands, the last ministerial appointment that was made was the education one, because they found that they did not have the expertise within their ranks, so they appointed a civilian, so to speak, who acts on behalf of the government. And because I do think, and which is why going back to 97, why that education thing was so important. How many Secretary of States have we had in the last couple of years? I don't know. None of them wanted to be it, really, because they all wanted to be one of the big four offices, as it's called. So they're just serving time. And why would you not have an expert? And why would your relationship with the civil servants be so weird that you have to appoint special advisors so that you don't have to listen to the civil service? So I think we need to find a way to have public consensus why we send children to school. And if I were the opposition, be it Labour or any of the other parties, I would make that a pledge in the next general election. I would say, when we win the election, we're going to create a consensus around public sector. And we're going to invite everybody around the table to contribute to this, because this is in everybody's interest. And if you don't turn up, we will name and shame you, and we will have an empty chair, and we will show the country that you're not grown up. So I think it needs that kind of an approach, and it needs that approach at national level. It needs that approach at local government level also. Instead of competing, we need to work together, because in the end, what are we competing for? To be one higher up the league table? To be outstanding in Ofsted terms, which incidentally only means that you are outstandingly compliant. It doesn't mean anything else. It just means that you tick all the boxes really, really well. So we need to drive towards that consensus, and we need to do that at all levels. Why? Because it's the best thing for the children, it's the best thing for the schools, and in the long run, it's the best thing for the country. And it probably, quite frankly, also in the long run saves us a fortune. Because I'm not quite sure whether the academies are going to continue the way they are now, having spent billions on them. And it might well be that under the next government, local authorities get some of their powers back. Why couldn't have that been sorted out properly over the last 20 years in the first place?
Yeah.
So essentially, I think everybody in education in this country is more grown up than the politicians. You have to reach that conclusion. So maybe the politicians need to take the lead from us rather than we take the lead from the politicians. And I think it's finally, I think it's an abominable insult that you do not recognize the professionals and the experts. Why would you ignore? Why would you make, as Prime Minister, an announcement that you want maths to the age of 18, and allegedly you have not consulted one single head teacher, be it primary or secondary, and there were no teachers on your advisory committee. What's the message here then, hey?
It's absolutely it's a total level of disrespect, and we've talked about this professionalism and teachers being treated like professionals, and the chartered elements and all the things that sit with that. We've had 10 in the last 10 years. We've had 10 education secretaries. The longest serving education secretary in modern history is never done more than 4 years. So it's like this that tells you. Now I understand that it is like that movement, and there's political movement, but and it's not all about the politics. We know it's not all about that, but we have got a huge challenge on our hands, and I think more broadly we could probably all wax lyrical about how broken the political system is from an education perspective, and how interestingly, I was speaking to a group of teachers today, and they were talking about how when a certain Michael became the education secretary, and how everything's gone wrong since then. But when we talk about that, we want to think about how students and parents, because they're obviously a missing element in this conversation, because very few people talk about parents, and how we go to that. And one of the things that I really like about some of the work that you've done, obviously there's stuff in with the Children's University and with KidZania, is about that, like you said at the beginning, that movement away from just the schooling, and actually the learning that can happen beyond the school walls, and the opportunity there. So I wonder if we could talk at that, because we've been of the volition, and certainly over the last 18 months to 2 years, that we've been talking to a lot of people who were saying we can't do it within the system, because there's absolutely no flexibility within the system. So why don't we work on the system or outside of the system? And we're seeing lots of online schools and lots of projects and innovation. And I wonder if we could talk at that for a little while.
Yeah, certainly. I just wanted to make one more point on the last bit, that if those politicians were so desperate to be Secretary of State for Education, when they get moved on, why don't they refuse to take the next job that's offered to them then? It's just a point, really. And I think the other point is, I think I'm right in saying that the last Secretary of State for Education who was a teacher was Estelle Morris. I think that's right. So I'll rest my case on that one. But we did with Children's University, we did a study. Children's University was all about, in fact, I've got one here still. It was kind of my invention, but children got a passport, and they would go to places where the learning was verified. They would collect stamps in their passport, and in Leeds and in Newcastle and in Lancashire, they would then go with their mums and dads to the university and get their certificate wearing a cap and gown. And it had to do with the social mobility aspect, right? Because very often the idea of going to university in the areas where the children lived, we worked with, was alien. The parents had never been inside a university. And my very last act as CEO of Children's University was to go to the first graduation, because it went global, to the first graduation of the Children's University in Adelaide in Australia. And I stood there and kind of gave my speech, and then noticed 2 Aboriginal twins, girls. And there is a video made of that. And you kind of think, well, this is it really. That's what we set out to do. And the mum who was, by her own admission, could hardly read or write, was inside a university with her children and said, I want my children to come here, right? So that's partly what that was about. But the evaluations we did, the conclusion was really simple. Children who volunteered to take part in out-of-school activities became more confident learners. Risk takers, if you wish. The more they participated, the more confident they became. And there have been some longitudinal studies done, I think in Sheffield, one of the places, that then in the end says those kids also get better results. Now, I would never stand up and say that was Children's University alone. That would be hugely unprofessional to schools and to teachers. But I think there is no doubt that the confidence element and the curiosity element and the understanding why you learn certain things in certain ways in schools is very important because I think we've alienated, we've moved away from that. So I think the contribution that we can make, and then it's about experiences, isn't it? And the KidZania research we did was really interesting. So when you come to KidZania, you have all these activities, flying aeroplanes and on flight simulators and heart transplants and you name it, cleaning windows, it's all there. Each KidZania has about 60 activities. And the youngsters, when they come, they get a bracelet because they're meant to be learning independently. And the bracelet's there so that we can track where they are. So at some point, I sat down with the analysts in Mexico City, which is where headquarters is, and said, look, can somebody tell me what the first choice is a child makes on their first visit? School visit. What activity do they choose? And can I have really huge samples globally? So we took a sample in London of 61,000 and in Mumbai of 85,000, and the global total now stands at nearly 600,000. So we had the first choices. And then my next question was, well, who are those children? Are they boys? Are they girls? Are they black? Are they white? Are they rich? Are they poor? Are they urban? Are they rural? Which country are they from? And we got those answers. And then the analysts went to town on this. And effectively, there were a number of key outcomes. The first one was all stereotypes are set at the age of 4. Right? So in the aeroplane, there are 2 activities, cabin crew and pilot. Pilot, 95% boys, cabin crew, 90% girls at the age of 4. Right? And so it goes. Everything goes with stereotype, whichever country you're in. Second finding was there's almost no difference between 4 and 14. So there's a big question about STEM because we push the STEM thing. And what we're finding is that actually when it comes to voluntary choices, it doesn't seem to make any difference. And I wonder, and the political answer to that incidentally was, but for example, girls now outperform boys in tests. And I kind of go, that's got nothing to do with STEM. That's got something to do with coaching. Because when they've done that, those girls, they've outperformed those boys, and they come to make their career choices, they revert back to stereotype because they've had no role models. They've never seen anybody like them do something like that. So that was one. And then the other one was that globally, regardless of their background, almost all girls choose activities below the age range. So 9-year-old girls choose 7-year-old activities. And there's clearly a big issue with self-confidence, self-esteem. It sits in that part. And then finally, children can only aspire to what they know exists. Children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds make narrower choices. Those children will start by cleaning windows, making the bed in a hotel, and working in a supermarket or being a courier. They will never choose the aeroplane or the operating theatre or the television studio as their first choice. They need multiple visits before they reach that level of risk-taking, confidence. So that research, which comes from a theme park, tells you a lot about education. So now if you are going to go and teach tomorrow morning and you have a class of 20 youngsters, 10 boys, 10 girls, you need to think that you need to approach that differently. So I think of course, there are the whole issues about experiential learning. They give purpose. They give a better understanding as to why it matters what we're taught in school. They link it to the real world. But they also provide us with information that beforehand we didn't have. Information that allows us to get to know our children better and to get to know them beyond the grade and the attendance percentage. And we sometimes forget that. So we've done some work with OECD and a few others to look at how can we capture data like that and make it meaningful and get it to the people who work with the children. So, and then the other thing goes back to my wife's school, I suppose every child is everyone's responsibility. Why would we not, in a school that is more than a school, work with all sorts of partners? The one that's always got me was careers education, because I genuinely think that teachers shouldn't teach careers education, because you could argue that all they've ever done is gone to school, right? So big school and little school and whatever else. But I think what teachers really, really do brilliantly, they are amazing project managers of children's learning. So what you do is you facilitate the learning. And instead of me talking from the textbook about what it's like to be an engineer, bring one in. Let's go and visit one. Yeah, and in a sense, make the magic. And every time you meet somebody, this is the thing, isn't it? Every time you create a situation like that, there will be a child that will say, I want to do that. I want to be like that. So we need to think about getting children to experience that kind of becoming me journey. And you can't do that in school. And it isn't even a matter of we can't fit it in, we haven't got the time. It is a matter of we shouldn't fit it in, not in school, because it's better done outside. The experience is better. So I've been advocating, because of that research and stereotypes being set at the age of 4, I've been advocating work experience for 5-year-olds. Yeah, and the health and safety people were fainting by the roadside, but not in that sense. But you can experience in all sorts of different ways, can't you? Meeting people is an experience. Being in an environment is an experience. But we need to connect that futures awareness piece much earlier. And parents have an important role to play in that, incidentally. You know, that we actually can have a proper dialogue with the parents saying, we've done this in school this week. In the next couple of weeks, could you do that with them? Well, why wouldn't we do that?
For sure, for absolute sure. I think we've got a job to do. We have been hearing and listening and talking to a lot of people around. We just can't keep doing what we've always done. Because if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll keep getting what we've always got, and it's absolutely falling off a cliff. Although Sigartamitra says that it's engineered to be perfect, to do exactly what it needs to do. It is perfectly engineered, but it's doing the wrong things. So we need to do it, and it's not preparing students and young people for. I'm always conscious to use the word students, and it makes it as if that's all they are. We're talking about children, young people, that they're more than just somebody who's studying. That we've got to do something. We've got to do something different for them. And I suppose this idea and this passion around play and around experiential learning, this learning that allows for risk and innovation is just perfect. But I think some of it is tied into the passion that you talked about very, very early on, which was about equity. And I know that this year, as part of the Bett show, you chaired a roundtable that was talking about equity in education, particularly. I know it was about other things as well, but that need for equity. And I wonder if it's I wonder if we can kind of close this on that really, really important point, that we make sure that we make that equity gap disappear as best as we can.
Yeah, and I think the really important part of that in that meeting, so there were ministers from all over the world and people at sea level from some of the very big edtech companies. And the numbers that are being thrown around become very scary, right? 268 million children globally are not in school. And you kind of think there's nothing we can do about it. What you then begin to realize is that bit about every child is everyone's responsibility. To see the very big picture, we all need to be a piece of the jigsaw. And if everybody does a little bit, then the view will become clearer. And I do think that, you know, we also, in fairness to the politicians, we also need to stop waiting for governments to do it for us. We need to take a lead. The profession needs to take a lead, whether people like it or not, and the business world and all sorts of other partnerships need to develop out of this. And some of it will go wrong and most of it will go right, but we have to have that go. And the pandemic showed us that we can do things very quickly, very well. There was a 999 call, and within weeks, most of it, but not all, but a lot of the children were being taught online, which is a damn size better than not being taught at all. Do we need to do it better next time? Of course we do, and we will. But we have the capability to do that in an emergency. Let's also try and do that when it feels less urgent. but it still is, actually.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Ger, it's been a brilliant conversation. I know there is a whole host of things that we could have gone into, and we're really grateful for your insights, the work that you've done consistently, and we're grateful for the ideas that you've got there. That I think there's a treasure trove of stuff that we could dig out. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not even joking. I'm listening. We need to go back to this, and we probably need to create some little snippets of that, because it's just gold of what you talk about. You talked about wilding the tame and more than a school. So we really appreciate your time this evening, and I think we might still have some daylight out there for you if you can get some daylight and get your feet on the ground. Ger, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Ben, thank you. And if I've gone red, it's because the sun's right on the window here. So I'm going to go and open some doors and let the dogs out now. But thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to be in your company. And who knows, we might meet again. That would be lovely.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Ger.
Cheers. See you then.
1,